All right, hello everyone. Welcome to another NFL team preview video for the 2020 season. Today we're talking about the Kansas City Chiefs. Finally moved on to the AFC West. This is the last AFC division before we move on to the NFC. So let's begin without further ado. So the Kansas City Chiefs are the defending Super Bowl champions this year. That's a gnat or something. And what's interesting about the Chiefs this year is that it is going to be a lot of similar players, similar makeup, and overall the organization feels pretty intact when you compare the Super Bowl championship roster to the roster that's heading into this year. There's very little turmoil in this offseason for Kansas City. There's very little change. There's very little roster turnover. There's a few new faces in town that they used to fill holes and depth pieces with through the draft and free agency. But overall, the consistency of the Chiefs roster, at least for right now, remains the same. So heading into the season, there doesn't seem to be any doubt that the Chiefs should be able to pull off a successful title defense and potentially win their second Super Bowl in as many seasons. But before we talk about the 2020 season, let's of course do the 2019 recap. The Chiefs were 12-4 overall last year. The offense ranked 6th in the league. They were 5th in passing, 23rd in rushing. Defense was 17th overall, 8th against the pass, and 28th against the run. Andy Reid is, of course, your head coach, entering his 8th season with a career record of 207, 128, and 1 tie. Taking a look at the snapshot of the previous 4 years, in 2018 they were 12-4, 2017 10-6, 2016 they were 12-4 again, and in 2015 they were 11-5. Ever since Andy Reid has taken over in this city, he has established a winning culture for the Kansas City Chiefs, and there's no reason to think that that's going to end anytime soon. And of course, we've mentioned the 10-year contract extension for Patrick Mahomes, which effectively keeps him in Kansas City for the majority of his career. You have a lot of returning key pieces. This is still a pretty young offense. There's not a lot of holes to poke at in this roster other than maybe offensive line, and we'll get to that in a minute. So let's go ahead and take a look at the roster heading into this season, and that is, of course, beginning with Patrick Mahomes, who we've already mentioned ad nauseum. I don't really think there's much introduction or things to talk about with him. The only thing that I would mention would be the knee dislocation last year that cost him 2 games. Other than that, he came back really without missing a beat and led them to a Super Bowl championship, and he won an MVP. So Patrick Mahomes is probably the safest bet you could make when it comes to quarterbacks in the NFL heading into this year. His weapons surrounding him are also still really good because they're mostly still really the same. Travis Kelce is, of course, your tight end. They did bring in Ricky Seals-Jones in the offseason to back him up. Your wide receivers are Tyreek Hill, Sammy Watkins, Mecole Hardman, and, of course, Demarcus Robinson is worthy of mention because he, too, played really well last year. A lot of speed, a lot of depth on this wide receiver position. There's no reason to think Patrick Mahomes won't be lighting up scoreboards for weeks to come. The running back situation has changed, but it hasn't changed so much that they've moved around a lot of personnel. It's just that we have another potential starter at the top of the depth chart, and that's Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who they drafted in the first round of this previous draft from LSU. Damian Williams did pretty well. He was serviceable last season, and he put together a great playoff run. But I think they're looking for somebody that's a little bit more dynamic, and Edwards-Helaire probably does provide that. There's been a lot of comparisons made to him between Brian Westbrook. And if you remember Brian Westbrook, he was a pretty dynamic player. So I could see where they're potentially going with this. Now they, of course, retain Damian Williams. They still have Darwin Thompson. And who was the other one? Darrell Williams, I believe his name was. So the running back room is still pretty solid. They've got a lot of good depth, a lot of interchangeable parts. So this could be a full-fledged running back by committee. But for right now, I'm going to pencil in Clyde Edwards-Helaire as the starter. Moving to the offensive line, we have Eric Fisher, who is removed from his injury. I forget what it was last year, but it caused him to miss some time, and I think that was probably a one-off. So Eric Fisher is still a very good tight end ever since entering the league as a number 1 draft pick. You have Andy Wiley at left guard, Austin Reeder at center. Now, right guard situation is interesting because Laurent has decided to opt out of the season, and he will no longer be playing this year. And props to him for doing that because he is a medical professional and he believes that his time is more well served this year helping people battle COVID-19. So who will fill in for his place? Well, I'm penciling in Lucas Niang, their draft pick out of TCU, to take over that spot. Probably better as a right tackle, but Schwartz is, of course, way more established and probably got robbed of a Pro Bowl last season. So I think Schwartz is safe at right tackle. So I think Lucas Niang, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, hopefully that I am, should probably slide into that role. They've also, of course, signed Mike Remmers this offseason from the New York Giants. I'm not going to pencil in Mike Remmers to start anywhere on the offensive line because, take it from a Vikings fan, he's not very good, especially at guard. That was a failed experiment for the Vikings when Remmers was moved to guard from Minnesota a year or two ago. I forget exactly when that was. Moving on to defense, for the defensive line, we have Okafor, I think I'm pronouncing that right. Jones, who is, of course, a really good defensive tackle in this league. Naughty and Frank Clark, who came over in the Seattle trade. Frank Clark is actually kind of a surprise for me. I didn't expect him to do as well as he did last year. For your linebackers, you have Wilson, Neiman, and Hitchens. And for the secondary, which really came into its own last year, you have Ward, Thornhill, Matthew, and Breland. They've also got Sorensen, who they can use in a pinch, who had a great playoff run last year when Thornhill went down and had to miss the playoffs. I really like Juan Thornhill. I expect him to do really well. I think he was probably one of my favorite safeties coming out of the draft 2 years ago, between probably him, Darnell Savage, and Jonathan Abrams, who is now with the Raiders. So that is your projected 2020 starting depth chart, if you will, roster, what have you. I don't really have a proper name for that. I probably should come up with something now that we're in the last division of the AFC, about to move on to the NFC. Taking a look at the schedule for the Kansas City Chiefs, not really much to say other than that there are a lot of really good teams present on here, and that's really by no surprise. With home game opens up the season against the Texans. We have the Chargers and Ravens on the road, Patriots and Raiders at home, Bills and Broncos on the road, and the New York Jets at home to round out the first half of the season. Ravens on the road, that hurts. Patriots at home, that's nice to see. You don't want to play against the Patriots, but as long as you get them at home, that's kind of nice. And then, of course, I think the Bills and the Broncos will probably be tough road games. Those are two teams I believe that are on the rise. Moving on to the second half of the season, bye week is in week 10. You've got the Carolina Panthers, Oakland, wow, I actually said that. That's going to happen probably more frequently than it should with this division. Las Vegas Raiders and the Tampa Bay Bucks on the road. That's going to be an interesting matchup. Patrick Mahomes and Tom Brady and his new digs. So that'll be a fun one to watch. Broncos at home, then we got Dolphins and Saints on the road, Falcons at home, and the Chargers at home to round out the season. A lot of really good opposition on the schedule. You know, you've got the Ravens, you've got the Patriots. Of course, you have the divisional matchups against the Broncos and the Raiders, who I think should be better this year. The Chargers, not so much. I believe that they're sort of in a rebuild process, if you will. Still a pretty good team on paper, but I don't expect them to be ultra competitive this year. The Saints is a pretty tough game, especially on the road in New Orleans. That might be different if they don't use fake crowd noise. I'm not really sure if that's the plan or not. Falcons should be another tough game. So it's not going to be an easy road by any means to get back to the playoffs for the Kansas City Chiefs, but it's an accomplishment that I do expect them to definitely achieve this season as they defend their Super Bowl title. Three big storylines I'm looking at is, of course, the offensive line. We already have one player opt out with Laurent, and we talked about that briefly, who I think could fill that void. I'm going to go with Lucas Niang. But there's always question on how well that's going to all mesh together, and especially if your best or your second best option as in terms of depth is Mike Remmers, somebody who I'm not too fond of, at least in terms of being able to solidify an offensive line position. Second big storyline is the running back platoon. How are they going to utilize all four of these guys? All four of them have really good skill sets. All four of them bring something pretty good to the table. Even Darwin Thompson showed flashes of brilliance last season as a rookie, and I think that he probably does deserve some more carries. And then the third big storyline, is this a repeat year or a regression year? I don't want to, predict that the Chiefs are going to do bad or Mahomes is going to have a bad season, but there's been times where I've seen players get really big contract extensions, and then the season that follows or the 2 seasons that follow aren't very good. And I'm not comparing Patrick Mahomes to any of those players that have happened to in the past, but it's just something to note. It's a possibility. And with a Super Bowl championship, it's always really hard to defend your titles. The Eagles learned that. The Patriots have learned that before. Every team learns that before. At least they have escaped the possibility of having the Super Bowl hangover, which usually happens to the losers. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch with the 49ers. But if anybody can repeat in the last couple of years, if there's a team that you would want to make a bet on to repeat, I believe it's probably this one. It's a lot of the same personnel from last year, and there's no reason to bet against them. All right, so that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this 2020 preview of the Kansas City Chiefs. Thank you very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.